Welcome to PAB 2012.
I want to talk about using the tools of journalism to create better content. And when I talk about that, I'm not necessarily talking about the tools in the physical sense. I want to talk about the ideas behind journalism and some of the techniques of journalism. It's not the typewriter or the camera, although I understand that there is film camera being used, or for that matter, the cigarette and the fedora. Although if you want to use those and they help you create better content, go nuts. The concept of journalism as objective only goes back a few decades. And if you spend any time looking at old newspapers, you will see hyper-partisan, hyper-actively salivating, politicized, deeply opinionated broadsheets. They were called, there's a reason that a wild argument is called a broadside. It's because it's based on the newspaper. The broadsheet. Think about all of the papers. There are tons of papers in Canada that have hyphenated names, right? The Globe and Mail. Where I come from in Cape Breton, we used to have the Cape Breton Post Record. And what used to happen was that there would be a newspaper that would essentially embody the conservative viewpoint on things, and there would be a newspaper that would embody the liberal or the Whig viewpoint on things, Kingston Whig Standard. And eventually, there was a consolidation, and journalism and newspapers came to believe that objectivity was the way to report news. And there was that wall that came down between objective news and opinion. Newspapers segregated their opinionated stuff into editorial boards, and even editorial boards got consolidated. So that's where we are today. We came from a journalistic culture in the 1800s where you had things like anonymous correspondence. You had people writing under pseudonyms. You had people writing just the most scurrilous attacks on people. You had people writing falsehoods. You had people blatantly attempting to bait their opponents into arguments. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Does that sound like maybe what we're doing online today? So I think that journalism was the original social media. That's a handsome fella, isn't it? It's a world in which we all have a voice. And pretty much everybody in this room has taken the dictum that you have the right to say what you want online, and that we've been given the abilities, or we've taken the ability to speak online and have our words distributed and read by others and shared and upvoted and liked and all of those things. And we've begun to investigate the idea that we collectively can engage in a discussion and a conversation, and we can create some sort of meritocracy where we decide what the good content is and who the good content producers are, and we reward them in some way, usually with book deals and paid speaking gigs, in my understanding, which explains why I rarely get paid speaking gigs and I don't have a book deal, I guess. But I think that there are things that we can learn from journalism. You might say, yeah, but we're better. New media is better than old media. We're faster, we're more opinionated, we're more engaging. We've discovered the tools of freedom. But even though we talk about tools like disintermediation, that we don't need the media anymore, we don't need those intermediaries, we don't need the record companies, we don't need the newspapers, we don't need the TV networks. We'll make our own content, we'll consume our own content. There are things that we can learn if we're going to create content that journalism can teach us. And there are things that we can steal, quite frankly, from journalism that will allow us to make better content. First off, produce is the first rule for me. One of the things that journalism teaches journalism students, particularly if they go to school or if they learn on the job like old school journalists used to, is to produce. If you look at the average newspaper reporter today, they're producing multiple stories a day. If you pick up an Ottawa Sun or an Ottawa Citizen, people are writing multiple stories per day. You look at some of the top line journalists in Canada. Someone who I respect a lot is a guy named Andre Picard, who's the public health reporter for the Globe and Mail. He publishes multiple times a week, and he does deep, in-depth stories. So there's no excuse not to produce. And I say that with every assumption that someone within this room is going to go to my blog or one of my podcasts and say, "Oh yeah? What about that 4-month period, jerk?" Point taken. We need to ensure that when we're creating content, we think of our outlets, whether it's a blog or a podcast, as a beast that needs to be fed. Not just because it's good to feed the beast for our SEO, but because it's the more you write, the better you'll write. The more you create, the better you create. I'm a giant Warner Brothers fan. And everybody here know who Chuck Jones was? Yeah, okay. So Chuck Jones, the great director of Warner Brothers cartoons, went to a art school in California called the Chouinard Art Institute in the early part of the 1900s. And when he got there, he met a teacher. And the teacher looked around at his class and said, "Every one of you has 10,000 horrible drawings in you. So you need to start drawing as much as you can so you can get all of those horrible drawings out so that you can start making good drawings." Has anybody ever seen like, old Hollywood movies like The Front Page where, you know, some reporter with a fedora on and a press badge and the brim will run up to a phone and say, "Get me rewrite," right? People actually used to rewrite stories. Newspapers are doing their best to get rid of all of those people who used to rewrite stories and edit stuff and fact check and research. But that doesn't mean that we can't appropriate that technique. There's nothing wrong with editing. There are times when it's great to get something out and just vomit out onto the screen your thoughts. But there are also times when it's great to edit, to hone, to craft a story, to give it to someone else to look at before you publish, before you send it out there. Give yourself the chance to edit your own work. If you write something, read it out loud before you hit publish. If something clangs, if something doesn't feel right, change it. If you're an audio person or a video person, look at what you're doing, listen to what you're doing before you send it up to Libsyn or wherever you happen to send it or upload it to YouTube. Edit. One of the things that happens in journalism from time to time, it happened here in Ottawa a few years ago, is that journalists run afoul of the law. Here in Ottawa a few years ago, a woman named Juliette O'Neill had her house raided and her office raided by the RCMP. And journalists, she was lucky in that the organization she worked for, the Ottawa Citizen, backed her up. They spent a lot of money on legal bills fighting the RCMP's right to search her house. Occasionally, journalists go to jail because they won't reveal a source. And don't get me wrong, journalists make great hay out of that stuff. And you know, they sort of, this is their claim to fame. This is their opportunity to say, yeah, we're heroes too. You know, we may not save children from burning buildings, but we go to jail for our beliefs. Once in a while. I haven't. I just sort of write about bake sales, but you know, I would go to jail. Anyway. Look, trust me, I used to be, you know, I never got to go to jail. You know. If you write enough and you write long enough and you write well enough, sooner or later somebody's going to take issue with what you write and what you create. They're going to say something negative about what you do. They're going to criticize it. They may even criticize you. Stand up. Don't just sit back and let that happen. Don't just sort of huddle into a defensive shell and just let those comments hit and not respond. Also, but separate the content from the person. If someone criticizes your content, go back and argue the content. If someone criticizes you as a person for whatever you do, then, let them criticize. Maybe I don't smell that good. Okay, whatever. Maybe I am stupid. That's their perception.
Thank you very much, Bob.
Thank you, everybody. Aw. Thanks, buddy.